She had been standing on the same stretch of windswept cliff for nearly 3 hours. The salt spray from the churning gray sea below clung to her weather-beaten jacket, and the damp had long since seeped through the soles of her sturdy boots. To anyone watching, she was just another figure on the desolate Scottish coastline, a solitary soul seeking solitude, or perhaps a photographer chasing the perfect shot of the rugged landscape. But Eleanor Vance wasn't chasing photographs. Her eyes, the color of the winter sky, were fixed on the shale and rock at the base of the cliff, scanning with a patience that bordered on the inhuman. She was looking for ghosts. Specifically, the brass and copper ghosts of military training exercises past. Shell casings. For Eleanor, this was a meditation, the methodical search, the weight of a cold piece of brass in her palm, the faint, an acrid smell of cordite that sometimes still clung to the inside of a casing. It connected her to a world she had left behind, a world of precision, of immense pressure, of life and death measured in milliseconds and millimeters. Her own ghost, the one she had tried to bury, was a highly decorated Royal Navy sniper, one of the finest the UK had ever produced. But that was before. Before the mission in the Hindu Kush that had gone sideways, before the memories that clawed at the edges of her sleep, before the voluntary discharge that had left her feeling untethered and adrift. Now, her battlefield was the beach, her enemy was the silence, and her only trophy was the spent brass she collected and meticulously catalogued in her small cottage. This particular stretch of coast was a known spot. The Ministry of Defense had used the adjoining ranges for decades, and the sea, in its relentless churning, often surrendered what the peat and heather had swallowed. Today had been a good day. And tucked securely in the canvas bag slung over her shoulder were a dozen .303 British casings, probably from a World War II-era Lee Enfield, and one pristine 7.62 by 51 mm NATO round, dropped by some modern unit on a training exercise. She was about to head back, the familiar ache in her knees reminding her of her 43 years, when she saw it. Higher up the beach, partially wedged between two large boulders that marked the boundary between the shingle and the start of the rough grass, it was a man. He was dressed in high-end, impractical outdoor gear, the kind that looked brand new and had probably cost a fortune. He wasn't walking or admiring the view. He was crouched awkwardly, one hand braced against a rock, and he was staring intently at the ground. As Eleanor watched, he scrabbled at the pebbles, his movements clumsy and impatient. He pulled something out, examined it briefly, and then tossed it aside with a flick of his wrist, a gesture of pure contempt. He moved on, and his posture radiating frustration, scanning the ground with a handheld metal detector that he swung in wide, erratic arcs. Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line. She knew that kind of collector. The kind who saw history as a commodity, something to be grabbed and sold, not understood and respected. The kind who had no reverence for the story each piece of battered metal held. She had seen tourists like him before, treating the battlefield sites of Europe as their personal treasure hunts. With a soft sigh, she adjusted her bag and began to make her way down the precarious path to the beach, intending to give the man a wide berth and head home. As she picked her way down, the wind carried his voice to her. He was talking, or rather complaining, into what she now saw was a satellite phone. "Complete waste of time, Jerry. Nothing. Just rusted junk. You said this was a hot spot. These Brits are so precious about their history, but there's nothing here." There was a pause as he listened. "No, the MOD restrictions are a joke. I got a permit, said I was doing a geological survey. Easy. These people are so easy to fool." He laughed, a harsh, grating sound that was swallowed by the wind. Eleanor felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. She kept her head down, her hood up, and continued her descent. her quiet, unobtrusive approach one of the many skills she had never truly lost. The man, whose name was Marcus Webb, an American with more money than sense and a burgeoning online business selling militaria, finally noticed her as her boots crunched on the wet shingle. He ended his call abruptly, shoving the phone into a pocket of his expensive jacket. He watched her approach, his eyes narrowing as he took in her unassuming appearance. The worn jacket, the sensible boots, the gray-streaked hair escaping from under her hood. A local. Just a local. Probably harmless. As Eleanor drew level with him, intending a polite nod and to pass by, he stepped directly into her path. "Afternoon," he said, his American accent loud and jarring against the sound of the waves. "Having any luck?" His eyes dropped to her canvas bag, which was clearly heavy with its contents. Eleanor stopped. She looked up at him, her expression neutral. "A little," she said, her voice soft, almost lost in the wind. Marcus grinned, a predatory, condescending smile. "A little? Mind if I take a look? I'm a serious collector, and I know my stuff." He didn't wait for an answer. He reached out, took the bag from her shoulder with a surprising lack of manners, and peered inside. He let out a low whistle. "Well, well, some nice .303s and a 7.62. That's modern. That's a range round." He looked back at her, a new light in his eyes. Appraisal. He pulled out the shiny 7.62 millimeter casing, holding it up to the light. "This is nice. Clean. Probably from an L115A3, the British sniper rifle. A beautiful piece of kit. The long-range wolf." He used the rifle's nickname with a kind of oily familiarity. "Takes a steady hand and a clear head to use one of those effectively. Not for amateurs." He slipped the casing into his own pocket without asking, a clear theft. Then he reached back into her bag and pulled out a heavily tarnished but beautifully preserved .303 casing. "This is the real prize, though. 1943. Head stamps still legible. Royal Ordnance Factory. Someone's granddad might have fired this on a training exercise before heading to Normandy." He tossed it carelessly in his hand, catching it with a slap. Eleanor felt a flash of anger, hot and sharp. This was a piece of someone's story. Marcus Webb looked at her, a cruel amusement twisting his features. He saw only what he wanted to see. A middle-aged, slightly scruffy woman, a local eccentric with a hobby she clearly didn't understand the true value of. He saw an easy mark. And he gestured with the .303 casing towards the L115A3 round he'd just pocketed. "You know, this modern stuff. It's fine for beginners. But the real skill, the real art of it is in the old ways. The patience, the instinct, the ability to make one shot count when it's freezing, you're tired, and a man's life is on the line." He was posturing, showing off for himself as much as for her. He fancied himself an expert, a student of warfare, because he bought and sold its remnants. When he leaned in slightly, a smug, condescending grin spreading across his face. "Care to try?" he taunted, waving the old .303 casing in front of her face. "Find something really old? Something that tells a real story? Or is this the extent of your expertise?" The question hung in the salt-laden air, a direct challenge born of arrogance and profound ignorance. Eleanor looked from the tarnished brass in his hand to his smug, expectant face. She could have told him. She could have pointed out the minute imperfections in the way he held the casing, the telltale signs of a faker who didn't truly respect the object in his hand. She could have told him about the specific weight and balance of the L115A3, the way the cold bit into your fingers on a long observation post, the sound a casing made when it hit the rocks in a place far, far from here. She could have told him that she wasn't just a collector, she was a former master. But she said nothing. Instead, She held out her hand, her gaze unwavering. "The casing, please," she said, her voice still soft, but now with an edge of tempered steel that he was too obtuse to detect. He laughed, a short, sharp bark. "Finders keepers, love. That's the rule of the beach. You want it? Find a better one." He pocketed the .303 as well, patted his jacket smugly, and with a final dismissive look, turned and walked away, swinging his metal detector. Eleanor stood still, watching him go, and the wind whipped around her, stinging her cheeks. She felt the cold knot in her stomach harden into something else, something that felt disturbingly like purpose. She hadn't felt that in a long time. She looked at the spot where he'd been standing, noted the path he was taking, and then her gaze drifted to the boulders. He was a predator, but of the laziest kind. A scavenger who didn't even know what he was scavenging. He had no idea of the terrain, no understanding of the history he was desecrating, no patience for the true hunt. And he had just made a very clear, very public challenge. He had also just stolen from her. In Eleanor's book, that was a line you didn't cross. For the next 3 days, Eleanor was a ghost on her own coastline. She was up before dawn, her movements fluid and silent, her knowledge of the terrain absolute. She knew where the old trenches, long since overgrown, still created subtle dips in the landscape. She knew where a platoon on a break in the '80s might have sat to smoke, dropping their spent rounds in the long grass. She knew where the winter storms had a habit of stripping back the topsoil, revealing what lay beneath. While Marcus Webb was stumbling around the easily accessible beach areas, his detector screaming at every scrap of shrapnel and rusted tin can, Eleanor was working the hidden folds of the land. On the second day, she found a near-mint condition casing from a Bren gun, its feed lips still slightly deformed from use. On the third morning, tucked into the roots of a gorse bush on a hidden ledge overlooking the beach, she found a small collection of .22 Hornet casings. Unusual. They were too small for standard military training. Her mind, working with old, familiar patterns, pieced it together. This spot, overlooking the beach, the approach. This was a sniper's hide. Not a modern one, but old. Possibly special operations executive. Training resistance fighters during the war. They would have used a smaller, quieter caliber for covert work. The casing was tarnished black, almost invisible against the dark, peaty soil. She cleaned it gently with her thumb. 1944. The head stamp was from a Canadian arsenal, a piece of a secret story, hidden for 80 years. She slipped it into her breast pocket, close to her heart. This one wasn't for her collection. This one had a purpose. That evening, she sat in her small cottage, as the radio playing softly. She had the Bren casing, the Hornet round, and a few other choice finds laid out on her worn wooden table. She cleaned them meticulously, not with the harsh chemicals Marcus Webb probably used, but with a soft cloth and a little gentle oil, the same way she used to clean her rifle. It was a ritual, a way of connecting with the object. She thought about the men and women who had come before her, who had trained on these very hills, who had faced their own trials. She thought about the arrogance of the man on the beach, treating their legacy like trash. The next morning, she found him again. He was lower down on the main beach, his shoulders slumped with frustration. He'd clearly had a bad couple of days. His expensive gear was now mud-splattered, and the smug confidence was gone, replaced by a petulant scowl. He was kicking at pebbles, his detector lying idle on the sand. He looked up as she approached, and a flicker of recognition, followed by irritation, crossed his face. "Oh, it's you again," he grumbled. Eleanor stopped a few feet away. The wind was calmer today, the sea a flat, metallic gray. Without a word, she reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out the Bren casing. She held it out to him, resting on her open palm. His eyes widened. He snatched it from her hand, his earlier rudeness forgotten in a flash of avarice. He turned it over, examined the head stamp. "Bloody hell," he breathed. Now the Americanism sounding clumsy. A Bran, 1943. In this condition,